background. All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Get Spectral, the fascinating history of spirit photography with Des Moines Public Library. Just a few housekeeping things, going to introduce myself in case we have not met. My name is Rebecca Cloud, pronoun she, her, and I am an adult services librarian here in Des Moines. And I am so excited to share with y'all the expertise and like just fascinating knowledge that Russell Lord from the Freeman, he is the Freeman Family Curator of Photographs at the New Orleans Museum of Art. I had a chance to see an exhibit that he put together a few years ago when I went home, and it was fantastic. So we are in for quite a wild ride. If at any point in time you have questions, either for me or for Russell, or your sound goes out, just throw it in the chat and we will get you fixed up. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Russell Lord virtually to Des Moines Public Library.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I really am grateful for you organizing this and for being such a diligent correspondent over time and space here. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. I'm delighted to be here virtually. These things are always a little weird. I normally love for these things to be very conversational. I've taught this subject a lot in college classes and graduate courses. And so I'm used to it being in the classroom, kind of in the classroom experience, or being in front of the actual objects, as is my great reward here at the museum. But here we are, and I'm excited to share some things about the history of photography and spirits, but also photography's kind of inherent relationship to death and afterlife. So I think, as befits a place like New Orleans, where I am, this kind of macabre approach to the history of photography is perfectly suitable. So I'm going to ultimately, we are going to get into what we might call spectral photographs, ghost photographs. But in order to kind of understand the context out of which those things come, I wanted to really start at the beginning. And the beginning is around the late 1830s. So you all might know some names or a name of an inventor of photography, but what I think is pretty fascinating about the history of photography is that some form of photography was invented by as many as 42 different individuals from Moscow to Brazil between 1800 and 1840. So there is this kind of strange phenomenon where everybody working independently is coming up with the same idea or variations of the same idea. But one of the people who experimented earliest was a British photographer named William Henry Fox Talbot. He was a learned scientist. He was a botanist. He translated Assyrian relief sculptures. So he was sort of a polymathic figure. And his very first photographs were made simply by placing a specimen, whether it was a leaf or a fern, as we see here on the screen, or a piece of lace, onto a piece of photographic paper. So a piece of paper that he had brushed with a chemical solution himself. And then he left it out in the sun. And when he removed that specimen, after the paper had darkened around it, he was left with the shadow trace of the subject itself. So right off the bat, we see that photography is not, at its origins, the kind of representative medium that we think of it today. You aren't getting the thing itself, you're getting its shadow. And that also kind of tells you a little something about its relationship to death, because you're seeing the place that something once occupied. You're not seeing the thing itself. And these pictures of a particular specimen of fern are particularly interesting because if you look from left to right, you'll see that it's actually the same exact fern that he used over the course of about a year. And if you look very, very closely, you will see that one thing is slightly different. The one on the right is missing one of the little fronds of the fern. So it shows that this little fern, which he used over and over again, got worn and pieces broke off. So already there's this kind of recognition that photography also can record things in a state of change, things in a state of loss and transition. One of the other inventors of photography was the name that you might know best is Louis Daguerre. Louis Daguerre was a Frenchman. He had been working on some form of photography since the mid-1830s. And by 1837, he was producing something that would ultimately become known as the daguerreotype. Here we see one of his earliest daguerreotypes. And it's an important object because it's the first photograph that we know of that includes a person. And that person is right here. In this little detail, you can see that what's being recorded in this photograph is somebody having their shoe shined. Otherwise, this looks like an empty Parisian boulevard, but of course it wasn't. It was a bustling Parisian boulevard with carts and people walking up and down the street. But the exposure was so slow that those people were not recorded. Anything moving was not recorded. So when we ask ourselves, we talk about how long exposure times were in early photography. You hear these kind of horror stories of people sitting for portraits with these kind of torture devices to hold them into place so that the photograph wouldn't be completely blurry. Well, how long did it take to make one of the earliest daguerreotypes? As long as it took for somebody to get one shoe shined, because you see that one leg is lifted up onto the block. But again, because it's not really recording the way the world really looked, there were some questions about photography's use as a documentary tool in the early years, in the early days. This is not true to what Paris was like. This is not people's experience of Paris. This is a photographic version of Paris that is somewhat strange and erased people from the world. One of my favorite early history of photography stories is the story of poor Hippolyte Bayard, another French photographer who had been working on a process that was kind of similar to, it was sort of somewhat between a daguerreotype and Talbot's paper process. Bayard had produced a means of creating a photographic image directly on the surface of a piece of paper. But there was only one. You could get one direct positive print out of this. He never did anything he never announced his process, and Daguerre beat him to the press. So as a result, Daguerre earned a lifetime annuity from the French government, and Bayard was left with nothing. So in 1840, after this had all been worked out, he produced this picture of a self-portrait of himself as a drowned man. And on the back of this picture, I want to read the inscription because it's kind of a phenomenal, macabre story, incredibly dramatic, but again speaks about this relationship of photography and death. So on the back, Bayard wrote, "The corpse of the gentleman that you see here is that of Monsieur Bayard, inventor of the process that you have just seen or are about to see," as you flip over the paper. "As far as I know, this ingenious and indefatigable experimenter has been occupied for about 3 years with perfecting his discovery. The government, who gave everything to Monsieur Daguerre, has said it can do nothing for Monsieur Bayard, and the poor wretch has drowned himself. Oh, the vagaries of human life." So here we have this kind of wonderful setup story about a battle for invention, success and failure, but all wrapped up in a picture that, again, because of the long exposure, because of the weird way that photography represents time at this moment, it does, in fact, look like a deceased person. Because photography was so strange in those early years, people were very wary of it. And you might have heard stories of early attempts to photograph people who had never been exposed to photography and how they were somewhat skeptical of what it was. This was often used in many ways against the people that were being photographed. Here, however, we have Honoré de Balzac, the great writer, who was quite superstitious. And when he was photographed by one of the Bisson brothers, these two brothers who had a very successful photography studio in Paris in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, he would always pose like this with his hand across his chest, which he believed was a kind of modest form of protection against whatever the camera might do to steal one's spirit. So here we have these kind of early expressions of superstition, people wondering about photography. Some of you may have seen some of the great early expedition photographs by French photographers or British photographers going to Egypt. And many of those photographs include indigenous guides that they had hired to go along with them. And they're in the photograph, usually for a sense of scale. One of the famous stories is that Maxime Ducamp, a photographer who traveled with Gustave Flaubert, the writer, to Egypt, always asked these indigenous people to pose in the scene, but he told them that the camera was a kind of weapon and it would go off if you moved, and that was their way of keeping these people still. So obviously there is a way in which early photography fed right into colonialist practice. It was used to catalog things. They used it as a weapon as much as they used it as a tool. And a lot of people didn't yet know what to think about it. This is also because we're used to seeing the results of photography, the final version of photography, which is the positive photographic print. But at the time, people were seeing a lot of negatives. Negatives were much more popular to be seen because sometimes people didn't make prints from the negatives. If you think about it, those very early Talbot photographs I showed are negatives. They're sort of the reverse of what it should really look like. And here we have a paper negative by a French photographer, Edward Baldus, of Nîmes, of an amphitheater. And you can see how strange this looks. It's a quite magical looking, but surreal looking landscape. And so when people started to see this world, they started to see the world photographically. It's not a way that we can experience the world, but it's a way that only the camera, it's a kind of the world that only the camera can produce. Moving forward, we have plenty of examples of people sort of playing with the conventions of traditional art historical representation. So one of the favorite themes is the fleeting nature of life, or the vanitas theme, or the carpe diem approach. This is a great stereoscopic daguerreotype, which when viewed in a special viewer would be seen as three-dimensional, called The Sands of Time. You can see what this is about. There was a book with fine print and glasses, which suggest the loss of eyesight, a skull, which is a reminder that death might be imminent, and the hourglass, which is slowly ticking down to the end. So it's a very somber way of thinking about one's place in the world. Also, the 19th century was one of great war. And the first thoroughly photographed war was the Crimean War. And one of the major photographers to photograph that war was Roger Fenton. This is perhaps his most famous picture. There is great debate about which of these two versions of the photograph Fenton produced first, whether the one on the upper left was first, meaning that all of those cannonballs littered the road and they moved them to produce the second one, or whether the second one was first and Fenton, with a little bit of artistic license, moved the cannonballs back onto the road to make a more stunning picture and one more redolent of death and kind of loss in wartime. You also have photographers starting to, this is a very important kind of precursor to what we're going to hear about later. You have photographers starting to play around with different darkroom techniques to create things and to produce tableaus that don't exist in the real world. This is Henry Peach Robinson's famous picture, Fading Away, which was exhibited at some of the early photography salons in the 1850s and 60s. It's produced from several different negatives, which he, because the negatives were paper, he was able to cut them up and put them together to create this tableau. We know that because individual versions of portions of the picture exist in other form. This is a slight variant, but it's a study of for fading away. The interesting thing to me about these two pictures is that Robinson was incredibly creative, and fading away is obviously about the loss of this young woman who is either about to pass away, as the title suggests, or already gone. And at the time, this picture was meant to address essentially the pandemic of consumption or tuberculosis, which took the lives of a lot of people. However, he also exhibited this individual shot of just the young girl, with the title "She Never Told Her Love." Again, thinking that it's too late to tell her love, but he was also drawing a parallel between the symptoms of consumption and the symptoms of being completely smitten with and lovesick. So there was this kind of romantic side. And I think it's really interesting that he used this picture for both of those kinds of stories. This is one of my favorite pictures in our collection here in New Orleans. It's a very large photograph. And I know that it exists in only two other prints, one of which is at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It's by a French photographer who's typically known to produce still lives. But in this case, he produced this very macabre tableau, which is really an indictment of the French healthcare system at the time. It's called Histoire Triste, or Sad Story. And if you read the text, you learn that one of Charles Aubry's neighbors went to a hospital and was refused treatment, or waited so long that he was ultimately sent home, where he died. And the whole article that Aubry has written in this photograph is about the lack of healthcare services for people in the town of Paris at the time. And to underscore the chilling effect that might have on the populace, he litters the photograph with bones, a skull. There are, as you can see, knives sort of holding the curtain back so we can read the text. Down at the bottom, there is some kind of camera apparatus and a saw in there too. I mentioned that war was an important part of the 19th century. That's going to also come back in our story about ghosts. This is a picture by George Barnard of the scene of General McPherson's death, except it's not the scene of General McPherson's death. It just looks like the place where it could have happened. It looks like the place that people who saw the death sort of described the area. Barnard went back to these scenes after these things happened and found places to photograph to create a kind of nostalgic memorial album about the Civil War. So again, this picture is about loss. It's somewhat fictitious, but we're already seeing how photography is not necessarily a straight record of the world. It's something that a clever photographer and a skillful photographer can use to their own ends. And then there is actual death in photographs. There is this kind of strange phenomenon of photographing children and adults shortly after they passed away in what we now consider post-mortem portraits. Victorian culture was very into mourning and very interested in thinking about different ways to mourn. And this, with photography, this became an important kind of component of that. You have to remember that there is, compared to painting or drawing, it's somewhat instantaneous. So you can get something that feels like it's very much linked to that specific moment in time. But it's also somewhat timeless, because once you have it, it's there, and it's a memorial or keepsake device. This is another one of my favorite objects in our collection. It's a bracelet made out of human hair. It's woven with human hair, and on the outside of the locket, you can see that there is a little initial, C, which was for the initial for the young girl, who you see on the inside. This too is woven with hair, her hair. We know from letters that came with this object that she died at the age of 9. This was a daguerreotype made when she was a few years younger than that. It was probably cut down after she passed away. And then this little daguerreotype was inserted inside the bracelet. What I find unusual about this piece is typically these daguerreotypes are on the outside of jewelry so that they can be seen. But in this case, it was on the inside. It was probably worn by her mother, which means that the portrait and the likeness was physically touching the mother's skin. So there is this kind of incredible tactile relationship that I think speaks of this kind of love and devotion, this maternal love and devotion for her child. And then there are just strange photographs. There is this whole series of photographs of nannies or people holding children, in which the nannies were not supposed to be present, but the children wouldn't sit still unless they were. And so you have all of these strange accidentally occult, we could call them, photographs, where the faces are either torn out of the emulsion, as in this tintype on the upper right-hand side, or draped in carpets or curtains, as we see in this paper photograph, or kind of behind a backdrop, but holding the baby's head in place with this hand that seems to come out of the darkness, or momentarily in the picture and then leaving the scene, so you appear almost like a ghost-like figure. These are all kind of either intentional or accidental ways in which photography has started to distort the world and in which strange things appear. And it brings us to a kind of really interesting phenomenon, which has its own discrete history, this history of photography and its relationship to the occult. This is one of the earlier pictures in that relationship by Edward Bugay, who showed these kind of levitating objects as if he was magically performing this magic trick, lifting this chair off the ground. I will this will be a familiar story by the end, but Bugay was convicted and arrested for fraud. It was later proven that he had used multiple negatives to produce these images, and had sold them, which was his ultimate downfall, because selling the photographs was what led to the charge of defrauding the public. I wanted to bring this picture back just quickly as a reminder of the great toll that the Civil War wrought on this country. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost. A nation was truly in mourning, and a nation really was looking to heal itself. And it's not surprising to me that it's at this moment that there is a major resurgence of the interest in belief in things that we can't see, as if there is an entire movement of people hoping that things can be different and hoping that the past 20 years did not happen the way that it actually did. So I think it's timely and it's important to consider how and when spirit photographs come into the world and how and when we become interested in looking at them again. It's therefore, I think, important and not coincidental that William Mumler arrives on the scene shortly after the Civil War. William Mumler was originally a jeweler in Boston, but he dabbled in photography, and it's said that his first spirit photograph was produced accidentally when he took a self-portrait, and on a plate that he had previously used but not fully developed. And when he developed the plate, he realized that he had double exposed a portrait of himself with a picture of his cousin that he had taken earlier. So the two of them appeared one more faint than the other. He thus decided to pursue spirit photography. He started, I think, to believe in what he was doing. And he became one of the most fascinating cases in the 19th century, in 19th century America, partly because he was incredibly successful. There was a huge trial that took place where he was brought to court, and a number of incredible witnesses were brought forth to either defend him or prove that he was a fraud. However, there are a lot of people who bought into this. There are a lot of people who fully believed it. This is definitely his most famous image. Just as an example, you can see all of these other kinds of pictures are Mumler's examples of spirit photographs. But what he would do is he would welcome you into the studio and he would invite you to think about a deceased person or a relative. And he would take your picture, he would disappear for a moment, and he would come back with a print that had a picture of you and presumably the person that you had been thinking of. It is a pretty incredible deception because a lot of these people have no idea where he would get the images of people who, if they weren't their relatives, very much looked like them. And in this case, the story is that Mary Todd Lincoln, widow of Abraham Lincoln, had gone into his studio, did not identify herself as the widow of the former president, and instead gave a fake name. And yet, and Mumler claims that it was only after he exposed the picture that he realized who she was, and that there was this kind of shadow lurking of Abraham Lincoln floating over and behind and even embracing Mary Todd Lincoln. There's another picture of, some of you might know that they also lost a son. And so Mary Todd Lincoln also requested a portrait with her son, which also exists. The trial is incredibly interesting. And there is a book, Rebecca just told me it's not in the Des Moines Public Library, but you can find a book called The Mysterious Case of William Mumler. It's got two incredibly academic essays in the front and the back, which you can read or not. I have read them thoroughly and enjoy them, but that's the kind of thing I like to read. In the middle, however, it is almost all primary documents. So you have actual transcripts of the testimony of the witnesses that were called to defend and to fight against William Mumler. The most famous witness by far was P.T. Barnum, of the kind of oddities fame. And Barnum was the consummate showman. And his presence there was to declare, this man is a fraud, and I know because I deal in the real deal and the real stuff. So there is this really interesting way in which he was sort of like trying to take on the competition and eliminate the competition, but also try to debunk this, the practice that William Mumler was very successful at. So this is, spirit photography is sort of one aspect of photography's relationship to the occult. Ectoplasm and photography is another one. It's going to get a little gross here. There were a number of mediums, people who believed to be the nexus point between this world that we can see and experience and a world that we can't. And seances became incredibly popular in the wake of the Civil War, and then again sort of on the eve of World War I and after World War I, and then again in World War II. So you have these kind of major movements taking place where a lot of people are gathering at seances to try to talk through these phenomena. And during these seances, these mediums are producing all kinds of fantastic things. Sometimes they produce things that look like figures. Sometimes these lights or luminescent things appear between their hands. Sometimes there is, as you can see on Ava Carriere, Ava C here, on her head, this weird little materialization. That is a kind of ectoplasmic a thing that you would kind of exude. Here is Helen Duncan, who was sort of famous for her seances and her production of ectoplasm. Ectoplasm comes from the word the Greek roots, ecto meaning outside and plasm meaning something that can be formed or shaped. And at the time, there were a lot of a lot of theoreticians and people of science who were trying to figure out what exactly ectoplasm was. And some people thought it was this kind of larval state of ghosts. So it was the ghost emerging, but not fully appearing. Helen Duncan was also taken to court and tried. Somebody was trying to debunk her theory. A couple of scientists were really interested in it and believed in it. But one person quite convincingly proved that what she was using was just kind of lace and twill with egg whites. And the really gross part is that she would actually swallow this stuff before the performances and then regurgitate it during the performances. So they're kind of, I mean, she went through great lengths. She lived until into the 1950s. She was actually the last person to be imprisoned based on the witchcraft law of like 17 something from England, and that law was ultimately done away with for good reason. But this is the kind of thing that you would experience or see at these seances. Photography became an important player in these seances because it was so dark. In fact, that was part of the mythology about ectoplasm. It wouldn't appear unless it was completely dark. And yet some photographers got special privileges to go in and photograph these things. And with a quick flash, as in here with this picture of Helen Duncan, you can see that it is pretty much like a piece of cotton with a glove attached to the end. And so under the light of photography, these things were kind of revealed to be fakes. These are two spirit photographs from our collection, and they have an interesting story, an interesting history. They're by unidentified photographers, but we know that they come from the Great Metropolitan Spiritualist Association, which was the largest spiritualist organization in London in the 1930s. The one on the left is much more figurative. You can see that there's a group of people sitting around a table at a seance. And then in the middle, in what looks like a field of ectoplasm, which honestly is quite a bit more convincing than this one, floats the face of a man upside down, presumably a spirit that they had contacted during the course of the seance. The one on the right is perhaps even more mysterious. The inscription on the back of the photograph on the right tells us that this negative, which would have been a little piece of glass coated with emulsion, was completely wrapped and sealed in its package, meaning that it was not opened, it was not exposed to light, and it was just left on the table of a series of seances on October 31st, a nice auspicious date, in 1931. And when the seances were over, the negative was opened, and without exposure in a camera, it was developed immediately. And there were these weird kind of dances of light, and the plate had broken, even though it had been handled very carefully. So the assumption here is that this plate captured the kind of dancing light of spirits from a place that we can't see with the human eye. The interesting thing to me about the Great Metropolitan Spiritualist Association is that it had a very famous figure who was one of its leaders. That was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the great writer of Sherlock Holmes. And I find it fascinating. He was a great defender of spiritualism and a great defender of spirit photography. And he believed in it. He wrote an essay about in defense of spirit photography. And yet he's the person responsible for the creation of Sherlock Holmes, who is famous for his deductive reasoning. So there is this kind of interesting push and play between what people sort of know to be true and what they want to believe. And that to me is the crux of, and the interest of spirit photography. I wanted to throw out some other terms of photographs here. So we know ectoplasm photographs. There was such a thing as scotographs. So scotographs or scotography was the practice of holding a plate, a negative, either touching your body with it, touching your head with it, and then exposing it, or then developing it without exposing it. So without putting it in a camera. And some mediums like Madge Donahue, who were famous for this practice, because they were mediums, presumably the spirit was flowing through them and onto the photographic chemistry. So there is this kind of belief in photography as this ultra perception, right? This form of recording that can capture things, and capture is an important word. They use capture all the time. We've captured this version of ectoplasm. We've captured this spirit. It's all captured on the plate itself, but it can do that for things that we can't see with our own eyes. So here you have an image on the left that was formed on a plate held by Madge Donahue during a remembrance service on November 8th, 1931. 1931 was a big year for spirit photography in general. So this idea that photography was capturing things that we couldn't see is not so far-fetched when you consider that by this time we have photography that can look inside our own bodies, can see things that we can't see there. We have photographs, exposures that are so fast that they're capturing movement that we can't see with the human eye, 1/100th of a second. So this idea that maybe photography could sort of also capture things in another dimension, in a space, a place that we can't perceive, was sort of how they built their theories around spirit photography. This right here is the work of Wilhelm Röntgen, the discoverer of X-rays. This is a photograph showing his wife's hand and her wedding ring and band. These early pictures, I think, are quite chilling, especially when you know that the photographs made by Röntgen and then a little bit later by Thomas Edison, also of his wife's hand, were exposing these people to incredibly high amounts of radiation, and both of these women lost their hands in a few years down the road. So there is this, again, this kind of blind pursuit of improvement in technology, but that leads to loss, that leads to a kind of death. This is another case that sort of links back to the Great Metropolitan Spiritualist Association. Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths were two young women, very young girls. This picture from 1917 was produced when I think they were 9 and 12, something like that. And it's one of 5 very famous pictures that became known as the Cottingley Fairies series. Elsie Wright was the photographer. Frances Griffiths is the subject, the model. They had had some training in art. They had been painters and they had drawn and they had played with cameras. And their father lent them a camera and they disappeared out into the countryside. And when they came back and printed and asked their father to develop the film, this is what he saw. And so he immediately assumed, knowing that they were artistic, that these had been little cardboard cutouts of fairies. But people started to pay attention to them a few years later when they took his camera again and something similar happened. So again, these fairies appear sort of like dancing around Francis. The father at that point was like, well, you can't use my camera again. This is a hoax. But Sir Arthur Conan Doyle got wind of this and wanted to use them to illustrate an article about spirit photography in the other world. And so they became quite famous. There's a kind of coda to this that Francis, I think it was Elsie Wright was interviewed in the 1960s, and she reflected on this, and she kind of left room in the interview for the possibility that these were real. So she even to the end of her days, she wouldn't divulge one way or the other really what the truth was about these pictures. I just want to shift. I want to sort of pull in these little asides as we go to kind of illustrate the relationship between spirit photography and what we might call fine art photography practice. So this is a great picture from our collection by Man Ray, the American artist who lived in Paris for a long time. This is actually a portrait of the poet Paul Eluard's wife, Noosh Eluard, from 1935. It was done as an illustration for a book of poetry by Paul Eluard called Facile. And this print is produced using a technique known as solarization. So if any of you have ever worked in a darkroom, you know that there is that magic moment where you have exposed the paper through the negative, a beam of light onto the paper, and there is a latent image. You can't see anything on the paper, but you put it in that developing bath, and this image starts to magically appear in the liquid on the surface of the paper. If you turn on the lights at that point, very briefly, the positive image that's coming out starts to revert to a negative image in parts, and you end up with something that looks quite ghostly and spectral like this. So this is a technique that Man Ray and Lee Miller, the great American photographer who was his partner for a time, they accidentally discovered this technique. It was known in the 19th century, but forgotten. And they accidentally discovered it when working in a dingy darkroom in Paris in a basement, and a rat or something ran across their feet. And so they turned on the lights quickly to see what it was. And then they thought, oh, we've ruined our prints. And then they looked at them and they realized that there was this kind of wonderful surrealist quality that lent a great aesthetic to pictures, the kind of picture they were trying to produce anyway. So they continued with it and exploited it for different properties. So there are all of these kind of darkroom techniques and multiple exposures, solarizations floating around in the artistic world, and they're put to use in spirit photography as well. So you have these kind of different practices that we believe and value on one hand, and then in other places, they're just debated as being either fake or true. Again, just a little bit more ectoplasm because it's there. It's so weird. I mean, these pictures, if they had been made by a fine artist and if they weren't purporting to be of this kind of actual spectral presence, they would feel like perfectly surrealist works of art. This sort of feels like a photo documentary approach. Again, one of the weirder, this is an unidentified picture, but one of the weirder examples of ectoplasm appearing on the surface of the table. Compare that with this incredible picture by Lee Miller. So I showed Man Ray, I got to show Lee Miller. She didn't always use that many darkroom trickery techniques, but she figured out a way for photography to become a kind of slice, to take a slice out of the real world and restage it as a very strange and unsettling thing. So here, the simple gesture of a woman scratching her own head, because of the way she's photographed it, almost looks as if this is a disembodied hand that is sort of grasping at her head. She had a knack for finding these kind of little moments in the world, and as a result was a surrealist kind of hero for the photographs that she produced. This is a little bit of, I wanted to show this as an example of the blending of sort of science and belief that ultimately led to kind of awful and terrible things. In 1883, Francis Galton published a book with this photographic frontispiece. This is the book in which he coined the term eugenics, which was the mistaken belief that the human race could be refined and improved through selective breeding. He had a very interesting take on how photography could support his theory. He invented or sort of perfected a kind of photography known as composite photography. So if you look at this, on the right-hand side, you have these pictures. He would photograph, for example, 8 different criminals on different negatives. And then he would collapse all those negatives and print them together. And the idea was that the composite of all 8 of these criminals gave you the ultimate criminal, and that you could identify who might become a criminal, who might become sick, who might become, etc., based on certain physiognomic properties. He then argued that this was a way that we could rule these things out through selective breeding. This is the theory that the Nazis, the National Socialists, picked up and ran with. It became a very problematic thing. And here you see photography doing something that it can't do, or somebody trying to use photography to do something that it can't do naturally, but sort of forcing this square peg into the round hole, and conscripting it for nefarious purposes. But again, it's this question of belief and reality. Interestingly, the spirit photographs that we have in our collection that I've already shown you, we got from a small bookstore because I was looking for a copy of this Francis Galton book. I was doing an exhibition about composite photography and its problematic history. And when I called the bookseller in London to buy this, he said, well, you seem to be interested in very strange things. Would you like to look at some ghost photographs? And I said, yes. And so he showed me all of these wonderful these spirit photographs from the Great Metropolitan Spiritualist Association. And we purchased those for the collection as well. Fast forwarding a little bit, I wanted to sort of show that spirit photography and different systems of belief in representation continue well into the 20th century and even today. Here we have one of the most famous and fascinating figures of the 20th century, Ted Serios, who produced what he called photographs, or thoughtography. So Serios was a bellhop for the Conrad Hilton Hotel in Chicago. And he claimed to be able to produce images from his brain as a kind of medium into the rest of the world. These photographs would be produced by somebody, as you can see here, holding up a Polaroid camera, and he used something that he called a gizmo, which was really just a rolled up little piece of paper that he touched against the camera lens, and then they would focus on his forehead, and the resulting Polaroid photograph would occasionally have an image on it. He caught the eye of a number of researchers, and ultimately Jewel Eisenbud in Colorado invited him out, and over the course of 3 years performed a number of tests, isolating him in rooms sometimes, trying to figure out if this was a hoax or if it was real. A lot of the Polaroid photographs that were produced, by the way, all of these are now in a public library collection, or at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So it's an interesting and fascinating archive. You can go and look at all of them online. A lot of them look like this. They're empty. There's nothing there. But the best ones look like this. And there are these weird kind of images that seem to appear that Ted Serios claims to have not essentially created, because he doesn't necessarily know what's going to appear, although they did in the experiments give him kind of target images or target ideas, and sometimes things would resemble those target ideas that they gave him. On the left is something that Ted Serios believed to be the Parthenon. On the right, this kind of indistinguishable thing. Sometimes you get portraits of him, but it was never totally proven. He was a wacky person. He insisted on being drunk during the production of any photograph. He was, by all accounts, an alcoholic, and yet there is this kind of fascinating chapter that he contributed to the history of photography and belief. This is sort of the program that I have to share with you. I did want to, in a shameless self-promotional plug, we have a really wonderful collection here at the New Orleans Museum of Art. We now have about 16,000 photographs from the 1840s to today. And we recently published a great book with Aperture about the collection, which includes a lot of really wonderful surrealist pictures. Technically no spirit photographs, but photographs like this one on the cover, made during the Bauhaus student movement of the 1920s. So it's a really good census of the collection. If you're interested, there's a lot of really wonderful photographs in there. And it's currently the 3,453,000 bestseller. So with your help, maybe we can get that down to the low 3,400s. I would love to answer some questions. I'm realizing that there is some stuff in the chat, and I'm going to look through the chat right now.
And while you do that, I have a question.
Yes.
So going back to like spirit photography, like Mary Todd Lincoln, first of all, was Mary Todd Lincoln expecting to see Abraham Lincoln in this photo? Do you know?
I don't know what she was expecting, but I think it's maybe the better way to put it is what was she hoping for, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
it's not surprising that you know so many of these people, even if it wasn't true, even if they knew it wasn't true, some of these people, it was enough for them that it gave them something to believe in and something to hope for. I think she either expected to see a relative, Abraham or Tad, Lincoln. So that's possible. Let's see.
I was also wondering, so these photographers, did they advertise this, or was it kind of word of mouth that they all got to each other that like,
There
you will see
there
a
are
relative?
Yeah, there are advertisements. I mean, the crazy thing is that so William Mumler he worked in Boston, I said. He was taken to trial in Boston, acquitted. And then basically the judge was like, but don't practice photography anymore. So he moved to New York and started advertising there and started photographing again. So let's see, we've got requests for book recommendations. So I'm going to try to, maybe I could, is there a way for me to email you a list after this,
Yeah,
Rebecca? And
definitely.
let's see.
Someone was wondering if you have written a book on this topic.
No, I've written a few articles, and there was an exhibition at the Aspen Art Museum that borrowed from our collection that I wrote a little essay for. I mean, I wrote like 1,000 words. It's not substantial, but but I have written some other things. I've written some reviews. I wrote a review in a very scholarly journal that I wouldn't recommend. It's not, I wouldn't recommend reading that, but the books that I reviewed were The Mysterious Case of William Mumler and Photography and Spirit by in the Reaction book series. So the Reaction books series is a British publishing wing, and they've been producing a whole series of books that are photography and they're really fun. There's Photography in Flight that looks at the history of aerial photography from early balloon photography to today. There's Photography in China. There's Photography and Spirit. So I really recommend all of those. They're actually I would say they're like college course aimed, but they're still fun to read.
We have a question from SN. In the course of spiritualism, where does spirit photography fit? Did it happen earlier or later in the movement?
It's an interesting question, because so I would ask SN what the which particular movement they're referring to, because there is, so I would argue that spiritualism has had all of these kind of different moments, and certainly some of them predate the existence of photography, but there is this kind of great moment in the 19th century where, particularly in kind of like these early industrial towns, and this is a big argument for the creation of the spiritualism movement in general. Upstate New York was a big epicenter of this. The Fox sisters, some people would even put Joseph Smith in there. But there is this kind of really interesting movement into spiritualism, and photography definitely was a part of that. It kind of was picked up. Mumler was sort of the beginning of that, but it trickled into other studios. And people would suggest that it was a kind of backlash against the Industrial Revolution at the time. There's this kind of ghost in the machine argument. Anytime the world starts to improve its technology or create means of production that are sort of inexplicable, we start to look for parallels in different worlds, the inexplicable, and sort of cling to these ideas. Interestingly, the Mumler book, Spirit Photography, there were like 6 or 7 books that came out in the early 2000s about spirit photography and ghost photography. And in my review of a couple of those books, I point out that I really think what these books are trying to address is the ghosting of photography itself, because this was a great moment when photography was transitioning from a physical, tangible object to this immaterial digital phenomenon. So there was this kind of, again, this backlash. It was like we were going back to these things that were very material, but still about something strange and inexplicable. So I do think that there is a real parallel between the actual movements of spiritualism and the rise in different photography.
Okay.
I would love to expand our spirit photography collection. Let me know if you see some. We're always on the lookout. Yes, the Fox sisters. Yeah, so that's a big one. And I do think that those were kind of parallel movements, photography and that spiritualist movement.
If you have another question, pop it into the chat. But to kind of tie it into the Midwest, is there any sort of research about the regionalism of this type of photography? Like, were there people in Iowa who were like hardcore into it?
That's interesting. I would say that is territory to be explored. We definitely need to learn more about this. There's still very little attention to this subject in the museum world. So I think that I think photography scholarship is still a pretty young field. But it would be of great service to learn more about those things.
Okay, so everyone look through all of your old photographs from your
That's
grandparents and all that.
That's right. Yeah.
So Jean has a question about any thoughts on spirit photography today, orbs, things like that, which leads nicely into a program I will tell you about before we leave today.
Great. The one thing I will say is that living in New Orleans, I get calls or emails probably on a monthly basis about somebody who has taken an amazing ghost photograph. And I really enjoy looking at them. There are some pretty great things. Some people know what they have and know what they don't have. But I'm always interested to see it. I think that there are some really interesting spirit photographs being produced today. I know, just in kind of preparing for this, I always try to, like I said, I've lectured on this in universities and college courses, but I always try to refresh and see what's happening now. And I saw that there's a pretty interesting Scotography movement happening these days. So that process that we looked at where you just hold the plates. And again, I kind of wonder if that has something to do with social media, because that's such a ephemeral thing that maybe people are like want to have this very physical contact and relationship with the process of photography. I don't Jean, I'm sorry, I don't have anything really super special to say about that, but if you have other kinds of spirit photography that you're looking at, let me know.
Will you be looking at spirit photography, like you said, Ghost in the Machine, of photographs that only exist digitally? Should we expect a book from you about that?
Yeah, yeah. At some point, probably. It's a very interesting thing. I've exhibited a couple of really great contemporary artists who have dealt with that. One of my favorite pieces is by this young artist who's based in Las Vegas, who produced she made all of these self-portraits, and then she uploaded them to Flickr Commons. This was maybe 8 years ago, with the goal of just letting Flickr Commons is a shared site, so anybody can go and take those pictures. So then over the past 8 years, she's been reverse image searching these pictures to see who used her self-portrait and why. And not surprisingly, it reveals the internet to be a misogynistic, weird place. But they took these pictures of Holly Lay is her name. They took her pictures Sometimes they credit her, sometimes they don't, but they're used to illustrate articles about depression. They're used to illustrate articles about women being overweight. So there are these kind of, it's like, I mean, it's an incredibly brave project to like put 800 pictures of yourself out there and see how people are going to use them like vultures. But of course, those pictures never had any physical presence other than this kind of ephemeral existence on the internet. So I'm fascinated by how that kind of circulation happens.
And Cindy has made a comment in the past. Some people have claimed to have taken spiritual photos, in quotes, at the Axe Murder House in Southwest Iowa, the Villisca Axe Murder House, if you have not,
Oh, I've got to
not
look it up.
familiar.
Yeah, I'll have to look it up. There is the Great Metropolitan Spiritualist Association morphed into the Institute for Psychic Study in London, so it still exists. And the top floor of that institution, which still exists, is where they held all the seances. So some people have said that that might be the most haunted, room in London. So there are these kind of interesting ways in which this still exists. And the Institute for Psychic Study does some really interesting work. They have a lot of scientists working for them. I think this sort of may dovetail with, Rebecca, a program that you wanted to mention that's coming up. But
yes, so not to tease all of you, but on Saturday, October 8th, starting at 2 p.m., we will have the Iowa City Ghost Hunters here at the Southside Library. They will come talk to you about the work that they do, the tools that they use, and some of the investigations that they've done. So just a few weeks. So read everything on the book list that I'll send you and that Russell will send us, and then come to the ghost hunting program and grill them about it. All right, are there any other questions? And I'd be interested to see what kind of spirit photographs Midjourney has too.
yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And a big, big thank you to Russell and the New Orleans Museum of Art for sharing all of their cool stuff with us. And with that, we're going to stop the recording.
Thank you all.